Hey, folks, it is, hey, Cascade, hey, Danny Thomas, Apple user Rob Wagner, Kojo. Nice to see you. Guys, it is Thursday, November the 9th, day 624 of Vladimir Putin's war of aggression against the people of Ukraine. I'm Peter Alexievich, and this is the Live at 5 from Kyiv, bringing you all the latest daily updates and latest happenings on the ground in Ukraine. And we're just waiting for a minute for folks to come in on the live on the Tickety Talk. They are being notified, and here they come. Hey, guys. Hey, Nightshade, Unspoken Truth. Thanks for liking the live, guys. How you doing, Doc? Good to see you. Good to see you. Hey, Magic. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. Let me pour myself a glass of seltzer. I had the good sense to get a glass tonight, so I don't have to be drinking out of the bottle. How's everybody doing tonight? Well, Magic, you don't have 1,000 followers, pal. You can't go live, right? Last I checked. Hey, PT. Hey, Sharon. How you doing? All right. So, guys, today is Thursday, November 9th, 2023. And for some of us, we remember this day because it's the day the Berlin Wall came down. 34 years ago today, I still remember it wasn't long before that Ronald Reagan had said those famous words, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And the people of East and West Berlin took hammers to that wall and knocked it down. At that time, a young, unknown KGB officer was hiding in his office in Frankfurt. And there he stayed throughout the upheaval and dishevelment. Lots of stories have been told about his actions that day, but they appear to be uniformly without any basis in reality. Like the rest of his depraved regime, the idea that he took weapons and drove the protesters away single-handedly, that is the story that is told, KGB coffee boy, exactly, are baseless by all accounts. Putin hid in the office, and that is emblematic of the man, if you ask me. So we'll have some musings on that in just a little bit, but right now let's take a look at the news. According to the Ukrainian MOD, in the last 24 hours, the Russians have suffered losses of 15 tanks, 18 APVs, and a whopping 36 artillery systems. Unreal. But much more interesting than any of that is the clear signal that the Ukrainian armed forces are hunting the pieces of electronic warfare and air defense systems of the Russian invaders. According to Alexander Ternavsky, the Ukrainian commander on the Southern Front, a Pol 21 radar jamming system was destroyed. Now, this is curious because the function of these systems is to destroy missiles that use GPS and radar to find their locations. And it was destroyed by a missile that uses GPS. Hey, Trav, how you doing tonight? Thanks, pal. A Lear 2 electronic warfare installation was destroyed. That's a $10 million unit. And additionally, what is supposed to be the latest and greatest of all of the Russian air defense systems, the S-300B4, which is said to have the capacity to shoot down hypersonic missiles, was all, and with a range of 400 kilometers, according to Russian military expert Igor Korochenko, was also destroyed. Further, UK intelligence is reporting that to make up for these many losses in air defense systems in Ukraine, the Russians are now relocating air defense systems from all across Russia. We know that they pulled the S-300 missile emplacements from the Kuril Islands, the Japanese islands that the Russians still control. We know that they're pulling air defense systems from along the Finnish border. Now, if NATO was such a threat and NATO was so intent on invading Russia, why on earth would you pull your defense systems from your 800-mile border with Finland? Because Russia knows that NATO is not the threat that they make it out to be in their press for the locals. They know it. It's nonsense of the first order. And so we see a consistent pattern, part of the what we call the deep battle, where the Russian air defenses and electronic warfare are being decapitated over and over and over again by the Ukrainians. Now, this has some interesting effects, and we'll talk about what's happening on the Kherson front in just a moment. It is worth mentioning, we never talk about casualties. I don't talk about casualties. I don't enjoy anybody's unaliving. But we know the Russian losses are steep, perhaps as many as 150 to 300,000 men. Today, President Zelensky made a rare statement where he said that Ukrainian losses are less than one-fifth of Russian losses. Now, for anyone who's interested in doing the cold-hearted calculus on that, you're free to do that, of course. But no matter how you count it, it's a mountain of dead sacrificed in the defense of freedom, and a mountain of dead driven to their end by a ruthless dictator in pursuit of his own power. Make no mistake, that's what it is. Here's a name that everybody should remember. Bogdan Yermokin. This is a 17-year-old kid. He turns 18 in 3 weeks. And most 18-year-olds, as they approach their 18th birthday, are excited to be getting out of the house or headed to college or into their first job, maybe even into the service, as Bogdan will be. Bogdan has been conscripted into the Russian army. And that would be a perfectly normal course of events since the Russians have a mandatory conscription for young men. Except Bogdan is a Ukrainian who at the age of 15 was kidnapped by the Russians and given to a Russian family to be raised as a Russian, to be re-educated and raised as a Russian. According to Maria Lyubova, who is the Russian Federation's Minister of Children's Affairs, Bogdan is one of 700,000. Now, I don't give that number credence, but that is the number that the Russians claim they have deported of Ukrainian children to Russia to be raised as Russians and re-educated as Russians. 700,000. The Ukrainians claim that it's about 17,000. The truth is somewhere in between those huge extremes, much like the casualties. We don't really know. But we know that the deportation and theft of children is a war crime. And now, this kid who's been in Russia for about 18 months, stolen from his family, his rightful guardian, his sister Valeria, whose cries and pleas for his release have fallen on the deaf ears of Moscow. This kid, after 18 months in Russia, tried to escape. He went to the Ukrainian border where he was detained by border guards and sent back to Moscow. And whether it's a punishment for his attempted escape or it's just part of what the Russians intend, he has now been conscripted into the Russian army and will soon be putting on a uniform and likely picking up a gun and being told to go and shoot at his former classmates, his former teachers, the people that he knew and loved him. This is the perversion of the Russian state. This is the evil that they do in the world. It is unconscionable to steal children from their homes and use them as soldiers like this. Francis Durnelly, who is a reporter for The Telegraph and does a podcast called Ukraine the Latest, gave the most brilliant speech in today's episode. I encourage you to listen to it. But he made the point that all those folks who are trying to push Ukraine to negotiate a settlement, to come to the peace table and talk, if they do, then the war crimes, the many war crimes, like the case of Bogdan, will go unpunished. Because Putin is not going to sign any treaty that doesn't do away with his ICC criminal court warrant. And it's important to remember that these war crimes continue. In the occupied territories every day, Ukrainians are suffering the worst fates at the hands of unmitigated sadists inside the Russian Federation forces. Make no mistake. For anybody who's thinking that it's time for peace talks, I encourage you to imagine that what would you do if your son had been stolen? Would you sell out 20% of your country and your boy for peace? A peace that will be tenuous at best. A peace that undoubtedly, once the Russians have the opportunity to recover their forces, will be shattered once again. Because the Russians have wiped their asses with every piece of paper that has said that there would be peace and that the borders would be recognized and inviolate. In the south, in Kherson, we are seeing what are perhaps the blossoming beginnings of our fondest wish, that the Ukrainians have established a bridgehead over the Dnipro on the least defended, least supported, least manned flank of this war. And they could potentially open an entirely new front in Kherson. We saw last week the decapitation of the HQ in Dnipro. And today we have information from the Russian mill blogger Romanov92, who's the guy that put out the pictures of the light infantry vehicles coming across the Dnipro, who is shouting alarms to the Russian hierarchy, saying that this is a problem in Kherson, and that in fact, the Ukrainians, he is reporting that the Ukrainians have moved an Iris-T air defense system, as well as two SAM OSA systems along with about a lightly armored battalion of about 300, have now crossed the Dnipro and are expanding the bridgehead. They are pushing their way south from Krinky toward Oleshki, and additional landings are happening along that front. If this is true, this could be the beginning of an autumn push that could end up isolating Crimea and cutting off the critical supply roads to the southern front. The Ukrainians are within about 1.5 kilometers of doing just that. And that's a tactically significant move. There is bad news from Avdiivka. There's no other way to put it. If this is true, and we have every reason to believe that it is, because I tend to trust the Ukrainian MOD. But according to them, at this time, the Russians have assembled a force of 40,000 men and machines, and are beginning and are going to use them for a full-on frontal assault against Avdiivka. 40,000 men and machines. That's 10% of the Russian army in Ukraine. 10% to take one town. And this town is different from Bakhmut. While Bakhmut was not tactically significant, my understanding is that Avdiivka could be. It could be the gateway to the Donbass. And they're currently 73 kilometers from the border, from the final border of where the Donetsk Oblast is. So there's 73 kilometers of Ukrainian territory in Donetsk held by the Ukrainians. But if the Russians break through in Avdiivka, if they really have a force of this size and this capacity, the odds are that the Ukrainians will have to withdraw, making it cost the Russians as much as they can as they do so, but that Avdiivka will fall. We are hopeful for a different outcome, of course, but if there's 40,000 men waiting to flood in there, it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be a challenge. It's estimated that there are 1,500 residents still in Avdiivka of the pre-war population of 30,000. In Russia's latest war crimes, the Russians have claimed that they have formed a brigade of Ukrainian POWs to now send into the fray against the Ukrainians. Yet another war crime. Unreal. We saw yesterday the Russian missile attack on a cargo ship, a civilian cargo ship in the port of Odessa. It has come to my attention that that cargo ship was loading up iron ore. It was not a food ship. It was supposed to be loading up iron ore destined for China. So now that's an interesting wrinkle in this story. We expect to hear, and we have heard, cries of outrage from the Philippines, who crewed the ship and whose crewmen were injured in the attack, and from Liberia, under whose flag this ship sails. But we have yet to hear from China. The fact that it was a ship bound for China may well be a wrinkle in the diplomatic coverlet of this story. Russia has already targeted energy infrastructure 61 times in the run-up to winter. So they're not wasting any time. In the last few weeks, according to the Minister of Energy here in Ukraine, the Russians have targeted energy infrastructure, power plants, distribution cells 61 times. Additionally, Human Rights Watch today said that 3,790 schools inside Ukraine have been destroyed, damaged, and looted by the Russian forces. These are all war crimes, and they steal from the next generation of Ukrainians their future, their education. We hadn't seen Putin in 16 days as of yesterday, but today he is purportedly in Kazakhstan at the summit of former Soviet states. He met with the president of Kazakhstan. It's worth noting that recently Kazakhstan agreed that it would enforce sanctions against Russia, despite its deep economic ties, and it pledged support for Ukraine. Putin hailed the historical ties with the former USSR states and uh, focused on the strong economic ties to Moscow. It is important to note that despite these historic ties and economies, none of the former Soviet republics have validated the invasion of Ukraine, supported it in any way, uh, and some have even condemned it. Putin also touted his hosting of a senior Chinese general in Moscow, hailing the strengthening ties with Beijing as important for political stability in the world, not in the way we did in the Cold War, but in a new way for the 21st century. Anybody who thinks that a Chinese-Russian relationship is strengthening stability in the world is not paying attention. UK has sanctioned 29 silver, oil, and gold producers and warned that the Russians are trying to evade sanctions using gold. That's according to the UK's National Crime Agency. They've also sanctioned a UAE-based financial institution for funneling $300 million in transacted gold to the Russians. The Ukrainian parliament approved the budget for 2024 today. 50% of the budget will be spent on defense. 50%. Compare that to the United States that spends 16% of its budget, thank you, on defense, Poland 10%, or the UK just 4.4%. Stoltenberg visited Scholz in Berlin today and praised Germany left, right, and center. Boy, he had nothing but good things to say about the Germans. So fingers crossed that he's there to sweet talk our buddy Scholz into sending some Taurus missiles. And that is the news that I got for you guys today. It is the 34th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I remember that time like it was yesterday. I can tell you whose apartment I was in when we watched it on TV. My friend Lori Bosco's. Lori and Megan and Colleen and Amy, they all lived in that apartment. And we sat there around the TV with Ziggy and Tom and a bunch of other people, just passing bowls and talking about the future. And the future seemed bright. We really believed that we had reached the win, that this was the end of the communist threat, that all our fears growing up of nuclear annihilation would go to the wayside, and that the former Soviet republics would embrace democracy and a free market system, and we'd all be rich and at peace. And none of that happened. Julie says she's got a piece of that wall. Julie, so do I. Encased in lucite. It says Time Warner on the side. It was given to me by a buddy of mine, Peter Quinn, who used to work for Time when it was Time Warner before the AOL merger. And it was one of 5,000 pieces that Time Warner had commissioned for their staffs. and for friends of staff. And that piece of the Berlin Wall is one of my favorite things in the world. It's one of my favorite possessions because it symbolized a time of hope and change and transition. And now, what we have seen, what we have learned, is that while Putin has paid lip service to the future, he has been deeply rooted in the past. These folks want all the benefits of democracy and freedom and capitalist economies, but they want them for themselves. They don't want to share them with the people. That's why 30 years on, 1 in 5 Russians don't have an indoor toilet. That's not a modern country. That's what we used to call the third world, though that's not a great term to use. I don't like that term. Yeehaw! Hey, F and hell, thanks. F and hell and I smell are my two favorite handles on this app. I'll tell you right now. I think they're brilliant. I think they're both quite brilliant. Okay, guys, we're going to go to Q&A. So I'm going to end the live stream on YouTube. Thank you, YouTubers, so that I can read